Welcome back, everyone, to our How to Read the Bible course. Last time we looked at Hebrew narrative, more of its particular narrative devices, and the world and culture it existed in. We also looked at the history of the hermeneutical vacuum which exists in many Christian circles, including Adventist, and the baseless resistance to literary approach to narratives and how this robs us of truly appreciating and understanding Hebrew narrative. Today is part 5 of our course, and we will first briefly be looking at genre, and then we'll go on to look at character, as in characters in a story. And we'll jump straight in and begin with the topic of genre. We've earlier talked a lot about how the Bible is a collection of many smaller books telling one unified story. But within that story and within these books, we find different genres. These books are written in different literary styles, and even within a single book, we might find 2 or 3 or more genres intermingled and used in turn. Why does awareness of genre and the genre we're currently reading in any given passage matter? I'd like us to imagine we're walking into a bookstore. You're after a new book to read, and when you walk in, your eyes scan the shelves. Every aisle has a different kind of literature. There's history over there and poetry here. There's non-fiction, fiction, horror, romance, and 100 different subcategories. Now, you and I both know that depending on the aisle that we choose, depending on the genre we choose, we're going to have a very different expectation of what that book will contain, what it will communicate. Many of us may find it easy and even natural to mentally shift gear when we read one genre versus another. When you pick up Austen's Pride and Prejudice, you're not going to read it like a textbook on physics. When you pick up a book on traveling in Egypt, you're not going to read it like an autobiography. Deliberately choosing a romance novel instead of a crime thriller will ensure you're not waiting for a threat behind every door your handsome protagonist enters. Genre determines not only our expectations of that literary work, but also what we look for in the text, what we pay attention to, and how we interpret it. All of this may seem rather obvious, rather straightforward, but why is it then that we rarely apply this straightforward awareness of genre to the Bible? Because the Bible also has genres, and as we've said, how we read a particular book or passage is going to be dramatically affected by whether or not we're aware of what genre it is or not. This further highlights what we talked about in our last class. Yet another important reason why we must not pretend that the Bible is not a work of literature. We must approach it applying literary analysis to the text. This doesn't diminish the text, it elevates our understanding of it. Each genre found in the Bible is communicating in different ways. And if we don't pay attention to the style of what we're reading, we miss the brilliance and often the meaning of the text. This would be true of modern works as well. Imagine if you tried to read a cookbook as though it were a medical student's textbook on surgery. Blood pudding takes on a whole different meaning. So, what are the main types of literature in the Bible? As we know, number one, and the most common, is narrative. We've already looked at an overview of this genre. This makes up about 43% of the Bible. After that, we have poetry, which makes up about 33% of the Bible. And then we have what we may call prose discourse, making up about 24%. But we also have many subtypes. For example, we have different types of narrative. We have historical narrative, we have parables, we have short biographical narratives like the four Gospels. If you read historical narratives, accounts of historical events, as though they are parables, well, then you end up in a wrong place, drawing ill-informed conclusions. Equally so, reading parables like they are historical narratives defeats the parable's purpose. In the Bible, we also have writings in genres or subgenres of prophecy, apocalyptic writing. We have genealogies, essays, speeches. We have letters, letters between two individuals, letters from one person written to a group. We have lamentation, songs, poems, wise sayings, biographies. There are a few, to say the least. Most books in the Bible have a primary literary style, but most of them don't only have one. They might have a little narrative, and then there's a short poem, and then the narrative continues, and then there's a paragraph that is a prophecy. The very first chapter of the Bible is an example of this. Genesis 1, verses 1 to 26, we find a historical narrative. It's a record of a historical event that has happened. In verse 26, God says, "Let us make humans." And then the description of him going on to make human beings is written in poetry form. There's a genre gear change here. Verse 27, so God created humans in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Some of you will notice that in your Bible, that verse 27 is in fact written in a different format, indented like it's a poem. And it is. It's almost as though this part is so beautiful or significant that only poetry would do its description justice. Then the text returns to narrative. But we see the same shift from historical narrative to poetry again in the very next chapter, chapter 2, verses 22. Up till this point, it's been narrative. Then the Lord God makes the woman. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken." Adam, when meeting the woman for the first time, has an outpouring of emotion, a connectedness with this person, and awe. Again, it's as though this part is so deep hitting that only poetry can capture it. It springs from Adam's mouth. The shift to poetry also indicates to us how he's feeling, what he's experiencing, a psychological insight into our character. Now, the challenge comes, of course, when you realize that biblical texts don't announce to us with glaring sirens whenever they shift genres. Any shift is much more apparent in the original language, as well as to those who are familiar with the literary styles of the time. But to many modern readers, the shift in genre can easily be missed. And so you might be reading a chapter with your prophecy hat on. It is likely, unless you're aware of it, that you'll continue to read the poetry bit and the parable bit like prophecy too. Now try to imagine what might happen if we read historical narrative as though it is wisdom teaching, reading about the violent wars of history and going, "Go therefore and do likewise." Reading historical narrative as wisdom teaching may seem absurd, but how many nations and politicians, events today are using historical narrative from the Bible as guidelines or teaching for how we can or should behave today? Let us take the example of Luke 16. In Luke 16, Jesus is in the middle of telling his disciples a series of parables. He tells the parable of the dishonest manager, then goes on talking about the law and the kingdom of God, and then in verse 19 he begins a new parable, the parable about the rich man and Lazarus. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things, but now he is comforted here and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us, a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." So, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, as told by Jesus in Luke 16, is often cited by some Christians as definitive proof that people go straight to either heaven or hell when they die. This argument has been made for centuries, and indeed, if you are reading this without paying attention to the genre, you can easily come to the same conclusion. And this is a rather dramatic example of why it's so important to pay attention to the genre you're reading. The story of the rich man and Lazarus comes in a list of parables. What is a parable? A parable is a short, fictitious story that is meant to introduce a new idea using old, familiar things. It illustrates a moral attitude or a faith principle. And we said this story comes at the end of a string of parables, all filled with symbolic, non-literal illustrations. The whole of the previous chapter is parables. The parable of the lost coin, the lost sheep, the prodigal son. In the parable of the lost sheep, most assume Jesus is not teaching that his followers have 4 legs and eat grass. It is a metaphor for a greater spiritual point. Secondly, another indication that the story demands a non-literal reading is that it contains an impossible conversation. The parable portrays the rich man in Hades, the Greek word for hell, speaking directly to Lazarus, who is in Abraham's bosom. Can people in heaven have conversations with people in so-called hell? For that matter, do people in heaven really watch people burning in hell, and this is their eternal peace and place of joy? Furthermore, the story is heavy with symbolic imagery. The rich man asking Abraham to send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water to cool his tongue. This can't happen physically, and what help would this be for someone who is burning alive? A single drop on the tongue? More figurative expression. The image of someone dying and ending up in Abraham's literal bosom. How big is this man's chest? Everyone can't end up there. The language demands to be seen as a figurative expression. And thirdly and finally, if we were to take this parable and ignore that it's a parable and treat it like it's literal, we would have to accept that it contradicts all the rest of Scripture. The rest of the Bible tells us that the dead are like those asleep. They don't know anything, they don't do anything, they have no consciousness. That people do not go to heaven immediately after they die. Psalm 6:5. In death there is no remembrance. 1 Thessalonians 4:15. Those who died are asleep in the grave, awaiting resurrection. Ecclesiastes 9:5. The dead know nothing. The Bible, in fact, compares death to sleep over 50 times. Even Jesus himself says so in John 11. After seeing this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. The real meaning of this parable is often and unfortunately lost because many use it to prove something Jesus wasn't even talking about in the first place. It wasn't his point, it was a fictitious story to illustrate something. And we must ask ourselves, is the purpose of this story to give us an actual glimpse into the afterlife, or does it serve a different purpose entirely? The real message of this parable becomes clear when we treat it as what it is, a parable. And once we correctly identify its genre, we can begin asking, okay, what is this story meant to symbolize? What was the new idea or lesson Jesus was trying to convey? Instead of it being about the reality of the afterlife, it's about how the poor are overlooked in this life, even by those considered righteous and religious, and how God and his kingdom actually treats these people in poverty. A poor man is described here as being so accepted, so treasured and valued by God, that he is being held close to the chest of the patriarch of the whole people of Israel. It's saying our patriarch, our forefathers, Moses, the law, the prophets, all stand on the side of this poor Lazarus. And the parable is making the point that if you don't even listen to what Moses and the prophets have to say about how to treat poor people with compassion and help in this life, what makes you think that an angel, or the whole army of heaven for that matter, will convince you if they show up to your door one day? He said to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. The message of this parable is important, but it's not what it has often been made out to be, and the fault there will mostly lie in misreading the genre. To sum up, missing the genre of a passage or a text can be disastrous. We don't read poetry like a shopping list today, and we mustn't read one genre as another in the Bible. Now, let's move on from genre. In our last class, we went deeper into Hebrew narrative and its various literary devices. We explored how failing or refusing to approach the Bible like literature robs us of a deeper understanding of it, and also of its brilliance. Well, within these narratives, all these stories we find in the Bible, we have characters. Characters speaking, acting, moving through the plot. Like actors on a stage, they bring the story to us. And characters in Hebrew narrative are presented to us in quite different ways than we might expect or are used to in modern Western writing. So we will now go into the second section of our class looking at character. We'll explore differences between characters in Western modern writing, and we will carry out a few text studies together to demonstrate how this all works. If you or I were to read any modern novel, we would find descriptions of the characters therein. Adjectives, descriptions are what bring color to our stories and depth to our characters. Let's take a look at some examples of character descriptions from famous books, such as this one from Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. Walking toward them was a tall elf whose face was ageless, neither old nor young, though in it was written the memory of many things, both glad and sorrowful. His hair was dark as the shadows of twilight, and upon it was set a circlet of silver. His eyes were grey as a clear evening, and in them was a light like the light of stars. Venerable he seemed as a king crowned with many winters, and yet hale as a tried warrior in the fullness of his strength. He was Elrond, half-elven, the lord of Rivendell, and mighty among both elves and men. Here is another character description from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. She was very showy, but she was not genuine. She had a fine person, many brilliant attainments, but her mind was poor. her heart barren by nature, nothing blossomed spontaneously on that soil, no unforced natural fruit delighted by its freshness. She was not good, she was not original, she used to repeat sounding phrases from books. She never offered nor had an opinion of her own. She advocated a high tone of sentiment, but she did not know the sensations of sympathy and pity. Tenderness and truth were not in her. And this description from Beloved by Toni Morrison. Except for a heap more hair and some wading in his eyes, he looked the way he had in Kentucky, peach-stone skinned, straight-backed. For a man with an immobile face, it was amazing how ready it was to smile, or blaze, or be sorry with you, as though all you had to do was get his attention, and right away he produced the feeling you were feeling. With less than a blink, his face seemed to change. Underneath it lay the activity. So within these examples, we find the typical character descriptions common in modern works of fiction, in novels, and stories. Character descriptions give us two insights as readers. Number one, the description of appearance. This may also include body language, details about their features, their clothing, mannerisms, ethnicity, and so on. And secondly, psychological insight. We are told to varying degrees of the thoughts of characters. We are told of motives, mental process, reasoning, secret thoughts other characters can't hear. Now, let's read a bit about a character from the Bible. Genesis 11, beginning from verse 27. Now these are the descendants of Terah. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran was the father of Lot. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren, she had no children. Continuing in chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abraham went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward the Negeb. So here we are introduced to a character named Abram, later to be renamed Abraham. If you know how the story continues, you know that Abraham is a central, huge character in the story. The father of a nation, father of a people that would be called sons of Abraham, the ancestor of the Messiah. Basically a big character in the story. And yet, there is no physical description of him or anyone else. How tall is Abraham? What is the color of his hair? Does he stand erect or stooped? Is he handsome, attractive? We don't have a clue because we're simply not told. To some authors, this would seem like a writing disaster. The contrast between most written stories and the Bible is considerable. This has led many Bible readers to great frustration. Why doesn't the Bible tell us what Jesus looked like? Why don't we know the appearance of John? Why would the text omit what the first woman, Eve, looked like? We have touched on this earlier, that not giving any physical description of its characters is typical in the Old Testament, how we hardly ever are given any physical description. It is simply not central to the point of the story. It isn't deemed important or even relevant, except when it is. So when you are told, in those rare exceptions, we know it's important to the story. Secondly, as demonstrated in Genesis 11, we are not given psychological insight. We don't know what Abraham is thinking. We don't know his mood, the state of his thoughts, how he's feeling, his reasoning or opinions. We are not directly told. God invites Abraham to do something dramatic and drastic, leaving behind his country, his people. What on earth is on Abraham's mind? As he sets out with nothing but a promise into a foreign land, far from stability and all he knows, what is he thinking? We're not told. So, how is the significance of this story conveyed? Without looks, descriptions, and the characters' feelings, how is it communicated? Well, it's communicated indirectly. This is perhaps one of the biggest differences between ancient Hebrew narrative and the stories we read in modern media. In Hebrew narrative, meaning is conveyed indirectly, not explicitly. So, how is the meaning conveyed indirectly? It's conveyed through what Abraham says and what he does. God invites Abram, and verse 4, so Abram went. Verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he, Abram, built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Meaning is conveyed through what people say and what people do. As you exegete any text in the Old Testament and in the New Testament too, you'll find a lot of this meaning conveyed indirectly. Let's have another example from the same story. Genesis 22 from verse 1b. He said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. Later on in verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for I now know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. First of all, this chapter is dramatic. The events are dramatic. And yet again, we are given no psychological insight into the mind, the thoughts, the feelings of Abraham, nor of Isaac. We are told what they say and what they do. What may seem puzzling is that the author here seems to have no time or room for describing something as important as how a father is feeling at the prospect of sacrificing his child. But somehow the author does take the time and space to repeat certain things. Now, as exegetes, we hopefully notice that in the text. The repetition. We know repetition is a significant Hebrew literary device. Verse 1, here I am. Verse 11, here I am. Verse 2, take your son, your only son. Verse 12, your son, your only son. We now know that when Hebrew authors include details, they are important, that it's a way of saying, pay attention to this, as is the case with repetition. To a Western mind, we might think, all right, we already know it's his only son, get on with the story. But why do we think a biblical storyteller wants to highlight your son, your only son? The repetition gives us a clue as to what the emphasis and importance of this story is. It is the door we're meant to walk through. These are the sort of notes we're meant to take when exegeting. To ask ourselves, what does this character's actions and words tell us about their motives, state of mind, feelings, allegiance, and so on? If you are exegeting chapter 22, you need to ask, why is this repetition happening? What is it telling me? Let's look at another example of how repetition in stories reveals something about characters to us. Genesis 12, verses 10 to 20. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord inflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say that she's my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning her, and they set him on the way with his wife and all that he had. Right. And then we read later in Genesis 20, from there Abraham journeyed towards the region of the Negeb and settled between Kadesh and Shur. While residing in Gerar as an alien, Abraham said to his wife Sarah, She is my sister. And King Abimelech of Gerar sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, You are about to die because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a married woman. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent people? Did he not say himself to me, She is my sister, and she herself said, He is my brother? I did this in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands. Then God said to him in the dream, Yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. Furthermore, it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all that are yours. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, What have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you have brought such great guilt on me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, What were you thinking that you did this thing? Abraham said, I did it because I thought, Surely there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, This is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, He is my brother. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, My land is before you, settle where it pleases you. To Sarah he said, Look, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is your exoneration before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And Genesis 26. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the former famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Gerar to King Abimelech of the Philistines. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, Do not go down to Egypt. Settle in the land that I shall show you. Reside in this land as an alien, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will fulfill the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands, and all the nations of the earth shall gain blessings for themselves through your offspring, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So Isaac settled in Gerar. When the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, "She is my sister." For he was afraid to say my wife, thinking, or else the men of the place might kill me for the sake of Rebekah, because she is attractive in appearance. When Isaac had been there a long time, King Abimelech of the Philistines looked out of a window and saw him fondling his wife Rebekah. So Abimelech called for Isaac and said, "So she is your wife. Why then did you say she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I thought I might die because of her." Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, "Whoever touches this man or his wife shall be put to death." Isaac sowed seed in the land, and in the same year reaped 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich. He prospered more and more until he became very wealthy. He had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household, so that the Philistines envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped up and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of his father Abraham. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, you have become too powerful for us." So Isaac departed from there and camped in the Wadi Gerar and settled there. Now at this point you might wonder, am I having a stroke? We're almost able to predict what is going to happen because of what happened in the other stories. Now this merry-go-round may seem a bit repetitious, a bit boring, but then we realize something. In Genesis 12, Abraham does not know Sarah is going to be the mother of a child that will fulfill promises God has made to him. And he passes her off not knowing this detail. In chapter 20, however, he does know. And he's at it again. Even though he knows she's going to be the mother of a child, his actions have not changed. This is making a point to the reader. It tells us something about Abraham's character, and that character is clearly flawed. It speaks of a fearful self-preservation, lying, deceiving disregard for the safety of his wife, disbelief, and what conclusions might we come to as we see further down the road that Isaac is repeating the same patterns as his father? The examples we just looked at from Abraham give us insight into the psychology of the character revealed in his actions and patterns of reoccurring behavior. But let's now go back to the second element, which is the absence of much or any description of appearance in the Old Testament. And we said how when there is such a detail included, it's going to be important. We're now going to carry out two text studies together and apply the principles we've been talking about. So let's do that. First, we turn to the book of Judges. Judges chapter 3, reading from verse 12. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. In alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, he went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. So the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, son of Gorah, a Benjamite, a left-handed man. The Israelites sent tribute by him to King Eglon of Moab. Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length, and he fastened it on his right thigh under his clothes. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute on their way. But he himself turned back at the sculptured stones near Gilgal and said, "I have a secret message for you, O king." So the king said, "Silence," and all his attendants went out from his presence. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber, and said, I have a message from God for you. So he rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into Eglon's belly. The hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, so he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. Then Ehud went into the vestibule and closed the doors of the roof chamber on him, and locked them. So here we have a story featuring two main characters, our primary character Ehud and our secondary character King Eglon. The narrative tells us that King Eglon defeats Israel, has been ruling over the Israelites for 18 years, and they have to give tribute to this Moabite king. Then the people cry out to the Lord, and it says the Lord raises up a deliverer for them, a man named Ehud. And we had some character descriptions in this story, didn't we? Beginning with Ehud. How was he described? Son of Gorah, a Benjamite, a left-handed man. The only physical description we get is Ehud is a left-handed man. Now, how is King Eglon described to us? He's described as being very fat. Let's begin by taking a closer look at the physical description of Eglon. Now, we may be tempted at this point to project modern fat phobia onto this story and equate being fat with villainy, character flaws, or dislikability of some sort. But we must remain in the text and in the culture of the text. Why does the author mention that King Eglon is fat? If we silence our inner prejudices and instead apply the golden rule, context, who is Eglon in the context of this passage? He is powerful, he is a monarch, and this monarch is wealthy. How can we conclude he's wealthy? Because he receives tribute from the Israelites. And Ehud approaches the king under the guise of paying tribute to him. Ergo, it was normalized for Israelite civilians to come and bring gifts, tributes to the king. In other words, Eglon is benefiting from an oppressive tributary influx of wealth, resources, and food. The Israelites are enslaved, made slaves to Eglon. This is the first significant period of time when the people experience slavery since escaping from slavery in Egypt and settling in Canaan. King Eglon's fatness is an expression of his extravagance, greed, and wealth benefiting from slavery. His hunger for power. It's not a comment on fatness in general, as having more fat on your body isn't an indication of your character any more than having less fat on your body is. But the detail is highlighted as a way of pointing to the context. A ruler who devours resources and lives in luxury at the cost of others. Now, let us turn our attention to Ehud. Yes, we are told who he is the son of and that he belongs to the Benjamite tribe. But the only physical descriptor we are given is that he is a left-handed man. Okay, that seems rather an arbitrary detail to include. So what? Why would the one detail our author chooses to highlight about this man and use up precious space on his expensive scroll to say it be that he is a left-handed man? Some of you may already be familiar with the Hebrew culture surrounding right hand and left hand. We read about these terms both in the Old and New Testament. Psalm 16, you make known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. Jesus said, but I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Act 7, but Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Exodus 15, your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. The right hand was seen as a place of honor and status throughout the biblical text. This was true of Israelite culture and of the ancient Near East. Being seated at the right hand of someone was a place of honor, of acceptance. If you were invited to a Judean wedding and you were seated at the right hand of the groom, this would communicate that you were the guest of honor. One's right hand is associated with the hand that acts powerfully. It is capable and empowered and exacting. Even today, in some cultures and religions in the Middle East, your right hand is considered clean while your left hand is not so. You eat with your right hand, not your left. And what else were we told about Ehud? Well, Ehud was son of Gorah, and he was from the Israelite tribe of Benjamin. He was a Benjamite. Benjamin was one of the 12 sons of their ancestor Jacob. Benjamin was the youngest son of Jacob, and if we recall the story of Jacob, he had clear favorites among his children. He had a favorite wife, Rachel, who birthed only 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Jacob, their father, favored these 2 sons over his other children. Thus Jacob named his youngest Benjamin, which in Hebrew means son of the right hand or son of the right. And so we read that Ehud is the son of Gorah of the tribe of son of the right hand, and he was a left-handed man. This description is purposefully being ironic. We know that Hebrew narrative can be playful in this way, but is pointing out his left-handedness merely to be playful? Well, no, because we now apply what we learned about purposeful ambiguity. Being left-handed in those days could either mean that you are literally left-handed or that your right hand is restricted. In other words, Ehud is disabled. He doesn't have the use or the full use of his right hand. And with this in mind, we realize that there really is a deep double irony being driven home here. The right hand is thought of as the hand of action and strength and favor, attached to power and positions of honor. And how did the Israelites often view disability and illness? Well, even up to the days of Jesus, it was associated with sin, being stricken by God. In the New Testament, Jesus' disciples see a blind man and wonder whether he's blind because of his sin or because of his parents' sin, a way of thinking which Jesus had to address and challenge. Ehud is from a right-handed culture, born into the right-handed tribe. A deliverer is needed to act in power and might, and all we have is a left-handed man, the unlikeliest of deliverers, who even in his appearance is weak, impotent and powerless, out of favor with God and inept. So like we said, Hebrew authors don't waste space on descriptions unless they're likely important. Verse 16. Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he fastened it on his right thigh under his clothes. More significant details. First of all, a 2-edged sword. A double-edged sword is made for thrusting rather than hacking. This is relevant considering what it is being used for. His choice of weapon speaks of specific intent. The sword is a cubit in length. A cubit was measured like one's forearm, so around half a meter. And then we're told he straps his hidden sword to his right thigh. Now, normally a right-handed person wears his sword on the left side because it is easier and faster to draw one's sword from the opposite side of your body. Now, Ehud carries his concealed weapon underneath his tunic, his robes, hidden under his clothes. You better believe that people were searched before approaching the king. But Ehud is allowed to pass. His disability is a visible one. People can see he doesn't have normal use of his hand or arm. Thus, he's written off as not being a threat. Because of Ehud's disability, he is not suspected and is underestimated, making him uniquely able to get close to the king and be left alone with the king. He said, "I have a secret message for you, O king." So the king said, "Silence," and all his attendants went out from his presence. "Don't worry, everyone. I can be alone with this man, Ehud. He poses no threat, clearly." Now let's turn our attentions back to the description of King Eglon. We've been told he's very fat, and that verse 20, Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber and said, "I have a message from God for you." Now, the room which Eglon and Ehud are left alone in is referred to as some sort of roof room. In Hebrew, the meaning denotes a well-ventilated room that is elevated above the roof beams. What we find is that in fact it refers to a toilet room. It was not uncommon in those days that the toilet be located near the throne room and be elevated on beams in some way, so the refuse could travel down and be collected below. And so what the text is in fact telling us is that Ehud says, "King, I have a secret message for you." The others are sent out, and King Eglon is relieving himself while Ehud speaks to him. Toilets in those days were less private than we may be accustomed to in the modern West, with places like communal toilet rooms and so on. So the king relieving himself in front of a subject he also cares little for and sees as beneath him wouldn't be out of the question. So Eglon is seated on a different kind of throne at the moment. Ehud says, "I have a message for you from God." Verse 20, so King Eglon rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it in to Eglon's belly. And because we know that Eglon is a larger man, he is also an easy target. He is stabbed in the stomach. The hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. The dirt is reference to, well, the reason Eglon was seated on that toilet to begin with. The detail about the length of the sword now comes into play because Eglon is so fat that a sword that length of a forearm disappears entirely into his stomach, including the hilt. Again, even the fact of Eglon relieving himself is meant to echo his gluttony in this context. Verse 23, when the deed is done, then Ehud went into the vestibule and closed the doors of the roof chamber on him and locked them. Ehud locks the bathroom doors on his way out. Following the assassination, he needs to buy himself enough time to escape without being detected. So he closes and locks the door of the toilet room, thus delaying the discovery of the corpse. Verse 24. After he had gone, the servants came. When they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, "He must be relieving himself in the cool chamber." So they waited until they were embarrassed. When he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them. There was their lord lying dead on the floor. The setting of the toilet room gave Ehud enough time to escape, because the servants of the king don't want to disturb him while he's relieving himself. And the text says they wait until they're embarrassed. Ehud escaped while they delayed and passed beyond the sculptured stones and escaped to Seirah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hill country, having him at their head. He said to them, "Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites, and allowed no one to cross over. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 80 years. The story of Ehud is a dramatic juxtaposing of who appears mighty, wealthy, powerful, luxuriating, and in control, versus who is seen to be weak, at a disadvantage, seen to be less capable, not able, and lesser than. This is who God chooses as deliverer. It is precisely because Ehud is underestimated that he is in a position to kill the king, and what was seen in an Israelite mindset as a sign of sin saves Israel from the consequences of their sin. Remember, this story begins with Israel sinning. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And Ehud, he goes on to lead the people into battle with such a brilliantly subtle use of language, with just two descriptions of appearance. The Hebrew author of Judges has communicated to his audience a wealth of lessons, of hard-hitting points, insights, and wisdom. This is just one tiny example of the brilliance of Hebrew narrative. Our second text study comes from 2 Samuel 14. Here we will find another prime example of when Hebrew authors include character descriptions, descriptions of appearance. You can bet it's important to the story. 2 Samuel 14:25-26. Now in all Israel there was no one to be praised so much for his beauty as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. When he cut the hair of his head, for at the end of every year he used to cut it, when it was heavy on him, he cut it. He weighed the hair on his head 200 shekels by the king's weight. Our story is about Absalom. Absalom is the prince. He is the son of King David of Judah. And what we've just read is the description given of him. And in a literary style where little physical description is made, there sure is a lot of it here. We're told he cuts his hair at the beginning of every year when it starts to get heavy. Notice the emphasis being made through repetition of language. When he cut the hair, he used to cut it, he cut it. Then we're told that when he cuts it once a year, he weighs the hair on his head and he measures that weight in gold. What can we deduce about this character? What does this text tell us about him so far? Well, here's a man obsessed with his hair, a man obsessed with his looks, a vain man, so vain that he weighs his own hair. You don't have to be a psychologist to conclude that this suggests some obsession he has with his hair. Now, with everything we've learned so far about Hebrew narrative, we can confidently say, right, I bet the hair on Absalom's head is going to play a significant part in this story. But then we continue reading this story. Chapter 14, no mention of his hair. Chapter 15, no mention of his hair. Chapter 16, no mention. Chapter 17, nothing. We might come to wonder, how can this be important? Why did the author feel the need to mention that detail? But then, in chapter 18, we read, Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. His head got caught fast in the oak, and he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. Why do we think his head got caught in that tree? He's thundering through the forest, riding full speed, his hair worth 2 king's shekels, and it gets caught in the branches. Now you might say, well, the text doesn't say that explicitly. It doesn't say his hair got caught in the branches. Yes, but the context leads us there. We are given the necessary information to paint a picture. When you read in that first text about what he's doing with his hair, what kind of character would you say he is? Obsessive, self-obsessed, narcissistic, vain, proud. And because we associate the deep pride and self-obsession of Absalom with his hair, the author is guiding us to conclude that what brought this man to such an end was by his pride and vanity and self-centeredness. His hair becomes the symbol of his inner character. A detail about his outer appearance is informing us about his inner workings. Again, this is the art of the Hebrew writer. The author invites us into engaging our imagination and uses subtle devices to speak volumes. Instead of stating outright, Absalom was vain, a self-obsessed, prideful man, this little description, the action and words of the character, are allowed to speak for themselves. Now, this invitation to notice details, but specifically to use imagination, is again not about imagining things which the context doesn't allow for. It's not about making things up. An example of doing this the wrong way would be telling a story like this. Jesus is giving his Sermon on the Mount. His dyed pink hair blows in the wind. In the background, unicorns graze while a fighter jet zooms overhead. This is an exaggerated example, but an example nonetheless of what some people do. But you might say, isn't that what we just did? Didn't we just fill in the gap by saying it was Absalom's hair and not head, as the text says, which got caught in the tree branches? Well, no. Again, because of the rarity of physical description and other details in the Bible, you know it's not you overstepping. It's not about making things up, it's about being invited into the imagination of the text. Practicing this exegetical discipline means training ourselves into constantly asking, why is this character described in this way? Why did he say that? Why did she do that? I know these seem like simple questions, but I promise you, if we ask these questions of the Bible stories, they come alive, both in meaning and in engagement. Before we move on, I'd like to have a sidebar and make a comment on heroes and villains in the Bible. Many assume that because we have characters in the Bible who interact with God in various ways, that these characters are showing you and I how to live. They are moral examples to us. Some of us have grown up with the Bible hero format. David, Abigail, Samson, Esther, Ruth, painted as heroes. A few years ago, the Adventist organization even backed the creation of an app called Heroes, an interactive Bible quiz game with questions about Bible characters. So these characters in Bible narratives are often presented to us as higher examples, goals, ideals, and heroes we are encouraged to be like, to live like, to mirror and emulate. But informed and honest reading of these stories actually shows us that this isn't the point at all. This isn't the point of these stories or these characters. Most Bible characters are shown to be deeply flawed. Not in a charming, permissible way, but often continuing to do anything but heroic things. They are not included in the Bible because they are the best people, save one, of course. In fact, sometimes they are the worst people in the story, as we saw in the story of Abraham's dealings with Pharaoh and Abimelech. By elevating any sinful, flawed character in the Bible to level of hero, the point has sailed right by us. The biblical narrative has never been and will never be telling us, you should be like these people. But if we view them honestly, we might see ourselves in them. When we honestly look at our own stories, we will see similar flaws mirrored, similar natures, similar behaviors, weaknesses, and mistakes. Bible characters are not perfect ideals for us, but they are meant to be relatable. They draw you into a tale about people like you and me. They invite us into seeing our character, our failures, from a new perspective. And they play out how God interacts with these deeply flawed people. If we deny their flaws, we miss the perplexing and fantastic way God treats these people. Hero creating is self-defeating, but making room for the full character complexities gives us access to a whole new world of understanding and relatability. Now, we're going to round off today's class about character in Hebrew narrative by looking at a final text study in Genesis 42, beginning from verse 6. Let's read together. Now Joseph was governor over the land. It was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. They said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." Although Joseph had recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Joseph also remembered the dreams that he had dreamed about them. He said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." They said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." But he said to them, "No, you have come to see the nakedness of the land." They said, "We, your servants, are 12 brothers, the sons of a certain man in the land of Canaan. The youngest, however, is now with our father, and one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It is just as I have said to you, you are spies. Here is how you shall be tested. As Pharaoh lives, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Let one of you go and bring your brother, while the rest of you remain in prison, in order that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you, or else, as Pharaoh lives, surely you are spies." And he put them all together in prison for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this, and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here where you are imprisoned. The rest of you shall go and carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me. Thus your words will be verified, and you shall not die." And they agreed to do so. They said to one another, "Alas, we are paying the penalty of what we did to our brother. We saw his anguish when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen. That is why this anguish has come upon us." Then Reuben answered them, "Did I not tell you not to wrong the boy? But you would not listen, so now there comes a reckoning for his blood." They did not know that Joseph understood them, since he spoke with them through an interpreter. He turned away from them and wept. Then he returned and spoke to them, and he picked out Simeon and had him bound before their eyes. Joseph then gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to return every man's money to his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. This was done for them. They loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed. When one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money at the top of the sack. He said to his brothers, "My money has been put back. Here it is in my sack." At this they lost heart and turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this that God has done to us?" When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, "The man, the lord of the land, spoke harshly to us and charged us with spying on the land. But we said to him, 'We are honest men, we are not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of one father. One is no more, and the youngest is now with our father in the land of Canaan.' Then the man, the lord of the land, said to us, 'By this I shall know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me. Take grain for the famine of your households and go your way. Bring your youngest brother to me, and I shall know that you are not spies but honest men. Then I shall release your brother to you, and you may trade in the land.' As they were emptying their sacks, there, in each one's sack, was his bag of money. When they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were dismayed. And their father Jacob said to them, 'I am the one you have bereaved of children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you would take Benjamin. All this has happened to me.' Then Reuben said to his father, 'You may kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you.' But he said, 'My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should come to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol.'" Now, many of us will likely be familiar with the larger story of Joseph and will recall what comes before and after the text we've just read. We'll know that Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. Joseph was forcibly taken to Egypt. There he ends up rising in power. And years later, his brothers show up in Egypt in need of food because there is famine in the whole region. Joseph just so happens to be overseer of the stockpiles. We were told that Joseph begins by hiding his identity from his brothers, and this passage told us that he asks his brothers to bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, who is not among them, with them next time. Otherwise, they will receive no continued aid. In our two previous text studies, we focused on how the rare description of physical appearance was used to communicate a lot about character to us. This time we'll focus on the other rarely included element in character description, namely psychological insight. And we're going to ask ourselves two questions. First question, what was Joseph's motive or motives behind sending for his youngest brother, Benjamin? Second question, was Joseph's harsh treatment of his brothers an effort to uphold the facade as ruler in Egypt, or was it an act of revenge? These two questions center on motive. Why is Joseph asking for Benjamin? Was Joseph seeking revenge on his brothers? Okay, let's go through it. First of all, we must acknowledge the dramatic change in dynamic and power between Joseph and his brothers. The last time he saw them, they were selling him to be a slave. Now, verse 6, Joseph's situation is portrayed no longer as a slave or a prisoner in the land of Egypt. Joseph has been set in the position as governor over the land by Pharaoh himself. This contrast and movement from helpless to nearly absolute authority is the background in this scene. We wonder what is going on in Joseph's mind. Is his mental state in a place of rage, revenge, apathy, forgiveness? Earlier in Genesis 41:51, Joseph has two sons. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The second he named Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortunes. This almost speaks of putting the past behind or moving on, or being grateful for good things having come to his life despite the bad. But the arrival of his brothers brings a dramatic tension back into the narrative. In fact, the text moves very quickly from stating in verse 6 that Joseph is in power, in control, and then very quickly an imbalance is induced. Brothers arrive, they don't recognize him. He is thrust into having to deal with this sudden disruption, a ghost from his painful past. Though it may seem a coincidence that so large and important events are mentioned in such quick succession, arguably this was done for effect. The reader receives an insight into the situation as probably experienced by Joseph. Sudden, shocking, and hard to digest. Now, following this meeting, Joseph inflicts a series of painful events on his family. He accuses his brothers of being spies, holds them in jail for 3 days, keeps Simeon back in Egypt, and allows the rest of his brothers to be troubled by finding he had sent the silver they intended to buy the grain for back with them. He knew this would cause them distress. Additionally, Joseph has not contacted his family all these years to inform them that he was alive. Neither does he tell them at their meeting in chapter 42. And he also causes his father the grief of having to make the choice between dying of hunger and sending Benjamin to Egypt. For Joseph knew that the famine would last for 7 years, according to Pharaoh's prophetic dream. The question now is whether or not the pain Joseph inflicted on his brothers and father was an intentional act of vengeance, or if he had different aims with his actions. The truth is, the text itself is unclear. A purposeful ambiguity about why exactly Joseph conceals his identity and makes false accusations against his brothers. Now, some may therefore conclude, as in the case of Samuel J. Mann, with the arrival of his brothers, Joseph's anger and a desire for revenge were triggered. The text describes only the emergence of his anger and the desire for revenge. But this would be projecting ourselves, our assumptions onto the text, instead of exegeting, drawing out of the text. There are other possible motives here. It is possible that Joseph wanted to keep his brothers in Egypt to test them and see if they had changed. He may also have kept them there to buy himself time for thought and reflection in order to plan his next course of action. Remember, he was shocked to see them. He had no time to think or plan how to act. After 3 days, Joseph releases his brothers from jail and commands that they prove their innocence and truthfulness by bringing back with them their youngest brother. Now, verse 24 gives us a bit of insight into his mind. They said to one another, "Alas, we are paying the penalty of what we did to our brother," speaking about Joseph. "We saw his anguish when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen. That is why this anguish has come upon us." Then Reuben answered them, "Did I not tell you not to wrong the boy? But you would not listen. See, now there comes a reckoning for his blood." They did not know that Joseph understood them, since he spoke with them through an interpreter. He turned away from them and wept. Then he returned and spoke to them, and he picked out Simeon and had him bound before their eyes. We seem to have many feelings crashing together here. Joseph is hearing his brothers talking about what they did to him, and he hears remorse. He weeps, and then he has Simeon tied up as a prisoner to assure their return. Sadness, grief, perhaps anger. Arguably, there is a temptation to inflict revenge, while also there's a hint of tenderness. This is further revealed by what he says in verse 18. "Do this and you will live, for I fear God." There is some inner thing which is keeping Joseph from murderous revenge. Whatever he is internally struggling with, his words reveal what is staying his hand. "For I fear God." He had the power to punish them. He was in a position to kill them. But Joseph's statement is that he fears God. This could be an indication to that his inclination was for revenge. But his faith compels him to be merciful. This is not the first time Joseph has given God honor for what he does. Joseph did the same when he gave a correct interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams. Now he gives God the glory for his demonstration of mercy. So we are getting a sense through repeated action, what the character says and does, of Joseph's character. We might be able to cast further light on our question, was Joseph's treatment of his brothers an act of revenge, by looking into the other question, what was Joseph's motive behind sending for his younger brother, Benjamin? And here's why. We return to our golden rule, context. What is the context of Joseph's family? What was their dynamic and story? Well, the story was that their father Jacob had 2 main wives. Their wives were sisters, one called Leah, one called Rachel. Jacob, in the days of his youth, had loved Rachel, but his father-in-law tricked Jacob into marrying Leah as well. This set the stage for a great deal of family favoritism. Jacob favored Rachel, and he also favored the children he had with her over the children he had with Leah. All of Jacob's sons were sons of Leah except for 2, Joseph and the youngest Benjamin. This created much jealousy growing up, Leah's sons hating Rachel's sons, and particularly Joseph, and the favoritism Joseph was shown as a child. And all this jealousy led to the other brothers finally selling him into slavery, which is how we get to this point to begin with. And with all that information in mind, what do we think Joseph was thinking? What was he thinking about Benjamin? Well, it is likely he was wondering if Benjamin was still alive. After all, Joseph's other brothers had sold him into slavery out of their jealousy. He had heard their discussion between them as they argued whether or not to kill him. He knows they are capable of murder. So naturally, he is worried about whether or not they have killed Benjamin or gotten rid of him too. He is worried for his youngest brother's safety, and the best way to find out if Benjamin is okay and still alive is to send for him to be brought to Egypt. Not only that, but Joseph could gain a better insight into whether his brothers had really changed based on whether or not they had inflicted the same violence against Rachel's other son. So, in conclusion, the unclearness of Joseph's motives in this passage does well in painting a picture of the conflicting emotions within our main character. The context helps us to understand his motives better, the context of his family history and the chapters which have come before this one. We must allow the purposeful ambiguity of the author to remain what it is. Our revelations come through the actions and words of our character. And as stated, contextual reading casts further light on our two questions. So, to sum up today's section on character, Hebrew narrative approaches and tells of character in a different way than is common in modern Western story. We find little description of appearance or psychological insight, but the few times we do, it is a sure message from the author to pay attention to this. We looked at how Hebrew narrative, instead of conveying meaning explicitly, conveys it indirectly. It invites the reader into making up their own mind and do some thinking. And although the lack of detailed description may seem to be telling us the opposite, biblical narratives are actually an invitation and an exercise in imagination. They require us as modern readers to be more involved than in a modern story because the biblical narrative gives us less information to go on. We have to make connections which in modern literature are usually handed to us by the writer. Characters in biblical stories are often wells of depth and complexity. We just need to discover how in a different way. And that's it for today's class on genre and character. Next time, we will be looking at the topic of proof texting. Thank you for joining us today. See you next time.